used to know how to respect the leadership of the gentry about such policies, she said, her nostrils flaring, instead of dogging our heels for favors and position. She looked at the pretty girl, wondering how someone so lovely could be so ugly and full of anger. Bettina wanted to slap her face. Avarita shrank back, her eyes wide.
Why, I've never asked you for anything, Avarita protested. Nor my family. Why would we? She snorted. There's nothing you have that we can't find better elsewhere.
That didn't dissuade the Coast Lord girl. Leona sniffed, drawing her head up and back from Avarita, as though she had caught a whiff of the sewer in Falas.
You know, your freckles are unbecoming. There's something wrong with your eyes, and your teeth look weird, the girl said, her voice low, nearly a whisper. I would bet my dowry that your family is not as lordly as you pretend. All of you downriver types are the same, just taking advantage of the rest of us. I refuse to allow you to take advantage of me.
The final sentence was issued as a challenge, not a dare or statement of fact. Leona's response took Avarita aback. She wasn't sure at that moment what it had meant or from where it had come. What triggered that, she thought, mystified by the attack. She knew she had to respond quickly, lest she lose an opportunity to both prove herself capable and defend herself in the future. Avarita might be dull, but she was not to be cowed by such pettiness.
I beg your pardon?
Avarita answered.
I do not know what you mean, but I do not appreciate your tone or your intention. When have I ever given cause to think that I would take advantage of you? And for what? The chores? We all have to help earn our keep, and the chores are how we do that. Someday, you might need to know how to weed a garden, she proposed, reasonably enough. I assure you I shall marry well enough to ensure that I never have to weed a garden, Leona huffed. Perhaps you will need to, with a face like that, but that is quite enough, Dina exploded, her eyes flashing angrily as she confronted the girl. No one wants to take advantage of you, Leona. In fact, I think most of us don't want to associate with you much at all. The way you complain, the way you treat us all, the way you act like you're better than the rest of us. Isn't that obvious? Leona shot back harshly as she turned toward the northern girl. I have been raised with the very best tutors, enjoying the highest society, and to appreciate the finest elements of culture. Not something a Narasi would understand, of course, she said, with an arrogant toss of her head. Be honest with yourselves. You all envy me for that, she concluded. You enrich yourselves by my presence here. Someday you will brag about it. That is how you take advantage of me. Yes, our lives are all improved by your presence, Mathilde said with a sarcastic roll of her eyes. It was unusual for the quiet girl to speak so forthrightly, but Leona's tantrum had clearly upset her as much as everyone else. All you have done since you came here is complain. Insult us all, brag about your imperial heritage, and act as if we're less than servants. No one cares about the great Coast Lord house you are from, she pronounced acidly. In fact, you reflect poorly on your lineage by your behavior. I pity your future husband for what he will have to endure, she added, her eyes narrowed. It was clear that the prediction stung Leona. You are all just jealous, Leona spat, whirling on the girl. You cannot stand that I am making you look so poorly, and so you contrive to attack me and talk behind my back. I'm quite comfortable saying what I think to your face, Dina assured her coolly. Consider it a fault of my barbaric Narasi bluntness. We have an unfortunate reputation for plain speaking, she reminded her. Perhaps we just aren't as subtle as Coast Lords, but we do strive to be polite while we're pointing out what a simply awful person you are, at least. I agree, Leona, Erin said, before Leona could respond. I am the oldest of 5 children, and the only girl. I've never even heard my little brothers talk to someone in such a manner. In the eyes of the Saganite Order, we are supposed to be sisters. I've never had a sister. But this is not how sisters act, at least to my mind. Erin paused to look at the other girls, who nodded in agreement. Perhaps your vaunted ancestry and upbringing never concerned such matters, but your behavior has been appalling. You owe Avarita an apology. You owe us all an apology. This is neither the place nor the time for your misplaced anger, as not one of us here has wrought that on you. Coast Lord or Sea Lord, Narasi or Imperial, propriety demands an apology for that kind of nastiness. A chorus and nods of agreement led Leona to finally reconsider her position. In the face of a consensus against her, she was forced to relent. It gave Avarita a tiny thrill of victory when the Coast Lord girl finally took a deep breath and did just that, though her jaw was set and her teeth were clenched as she delivered the carefully worded, barely acceptable apology before stomping off. Katina doubted the sincerity of her words, of course. If it hadn't been for the overwhelming social pressure and the willingness of the rest of the girls to stand up to her, she had no doubt that Leona would have continued her abuse indefinitely. While Avarita accepted her apology at face value like a lady of breeding should, Katina wanted to grab the insufferable girl by the hair and smash her face into the nearest box bed, or push her down a well or something, which might be awkward to explain. It was difficult bearing two such tortures, but she managed. That was a small victory. But she had learned something valuable. Leona's outburst had revealed the willingness of some to accept the reinstitution of slavery. She wondered about the girl's other politics and whether Leona and her family, therefore, supported the vile Count Vicatrol. If so, Katina thought, the girl very much might need to be locked into her sleeping box. In any case, she would be keeping a close eye on Leona, she decided. She doubted the girl could be trustworthy. Her vicious nature and her high opinion of herself seemed to mask some other problem, Katina figured, and it raised an alarm in her mind. Not that Avarita bothered with that sort of suspicion. Her demure alias was quite content to let Leona get away with such behavior, as long as it wasn't directed at her. Avarita was dull and wanted to get along with everybody. It took a lot of effort to suppress Katina's more violent impulses. But the conflict had reminded her of something important. Her eye. When the Coast Lord girl pointed out the flaws in her features, she had mentioned how her eyes looked funny, and she wasn't wrong about that, at least. Katina realized that the spell that concealed her violet eye color was fading. She knew she had to seek out her father, in whatever disguise he was wearing, and get him to refresh the enchantment before she attracted more attention. She could not bear two torches of her identity if she suddenly showed up to breakfast with purple eyes. People would talk, and Leona most of all. She wanted to dismiss the girl's unreasonable and unpleasant attitude toward her and the others, and she was tempted to do just that. Avarita did not seek any trouble. But Katina knew better. She recalled her mother's voice in her head, reminding her to never underestimate anyone, particularly someone who was so quick to judge and take offense at, well, everything. Mother would urge caution with someone like that. She was soon borne out. While she was more polite on the surface after the argument, Leona began shifting the focus of her aggravation from the Saganite Order to Avarita and Dina, making both girls a target of her quiet rage without crossing the frontier into such open hostility once again. Leona didn't overtly challenge either of them anymore, but her comments were universally unfriendly and frequently unkind in the worst way. The only good thing that arose from it was the feeling among the other girls that they were united on at least one topic. Leona was awful. Perhaps it was not the foundation of some mystic sisterhood, but it did help bind them into a friendship. Chapter 7. The Mysterious Arch. In antiquity, the Sagan Institute was founded to provide a haven for those called to the sacred study,
of the blessed darkness and the eternal heavens above. In their wisdom, they chose to build Palomar Abbey as a place of refuge and observation of our ancestors, the sacred stars, from whom all things are descended. For, as Sagan declared, we are all made of star stuff, and every fragment of our being was once forged in the belly of a star. Our observations of the heavens are truly just our celestial souls peering back at the billions of blazing ancestors of the sacred cosmos. From the Litany of the Cosmos. "What's that?" Avarita asked Night Brother Henri as she lugged a basket of cuttings to the far end of the garden. This portion was too close to the cliff face to get enough sun for most things, the monk had explained, but there were plenty of vegetables that preferred less sunlight and more shade. The thing that had attracted Kattina's attention wasn't a natural part of the cliff, however. It seemed to be some sort of square stone arch set within the natural rock, at least 10 feet high and twice that across. There were 2 lintels a foot wide on each side, supporting a thick slab that protruded slightly from the rock. The entire thing was covered with vines and foliage, to the point where if she had been standing next to it, she likely wouldn't have noticed, but from this distance it was clearer that the structure was artificial and woefully out of place. "That nocturne is a remnant of the Abbey's founding," the old monk explained patiently as he paused on the garden path. "You have a good eye. It's been here since the beginning, according to the law. No one knows why it was built or what it was used for, but it's at least as old as the temple," he said, glancing toward the tower looming overhead. "It's one of the ways we know about our founding. The inscription is clear enough," he added. "Inscription?" she asked as the other girls filed through the garden with hoes and baskets, so enwrapped in their conversations that they hadn't even seen the arch. "There's an inscription?" "In Old High Peruanese, of course," nodded Brother Henri. "A simple one. It reads, 'The Sagan Institute.' That's an old Peruanese word for temple," he added. "That's how we know the place has been run continuously for all of these centuries." Avarita nodded and studied the arch more carefully. Yes, she decided. She did see some sort of faint writing carved out of the rock, but it was so old and weathered that it wasn't clear enough to read. It did add something to the garden, though, she decided. Like those fake ancient ruins some coast lords had installed on their grounds to make believe that they were living on some ancient remnant of imperial civilization. It lent a bit of mystery to the place. But there was more to the arch than met the eye, Kattina knew instinctively. Indeed, the certain sense that she'd possessed since childhood was bothered by the arch. Since she was a little girl, Gertina had been able to sense the presence of metals, all sorts of metals, just by proximity. It had helped to make her an adept thief and promised a stronger Ruggiera to come. Most of the time, she didn't even realize she was doing it, until something unusual came along that challenged her senses. That strange ability was screaming at her now. There was metal behind the earth and foliage under the arch, she knew with certainty. A great gob of metal, some sort of iron or steel, or perhaps something more exotic. She could not determine its exact composition, but she had no doubts that there was a lot of metal buried just inches away under the accumulated soil and foliage under the arch.
"Are there any more of these arches?"
she asked curiously, desperately trying to sound like a provincial simpleton. "Oh, the Abbey holds a few old mysteries," assured the gardener with a chuckle that was pregnant with meaning. "The ancients often had a peculiar way of looking at things. They built things for which we have no understanding now. I'm sure they were important in their time,
But a lot of the unimportant things were lost over the years. That thing was built there before the very first Archmage took power in Perwyn, he reminded her. A lot of things have happened in the world since then.
Bettina shuddered involuntarily at the thought. This place had been centuries old when her illustrious ancestor, Kira the Great, had come to Alshar from Vol. It was there when the first Sea Lords had built their havens along the Great Bay. It had been old when the Coast Lords had established the counties of Falas and Reims. It had been old when the Norasi had conquered the Magocracy and elevated the first Duke of Alshar. The feeling of age seemed to permeate the soil there in Ejecta.
How hath it survived? Avarita wondered aloud.
Because no one thought to destroy it, even if they could, chuckled Henri. The Abbey has either been too important to attempt its destruction, or believed it too unimportant to bother with. I only hope that continues to hold true, he added with a troubled note to his voice.
What do you mean?
Avarita asked, because it was the kind of dumb question dull Avarita would ask. Brother Henri considered thoughtfully, choosing his words carefully.
The new council of counts in Falas that has risen since the Duke died is not entirely popular with some folk, the monk explained with a critical sigh. With quite a few folk, actually. That rascal, Vicatrol, is moving against that opposition. He's brought his soldiers from Reims, he supplied grimly. And worse. Don't be surprised if we have visitors appear here at the Abbey.
Pilgrims?
Avarita asked, confused.
No, lass. Not pilgrims. Royal censors, he warned softly.
Avarita's eyes got big. It was one thing to hear such rumors in the streets and shops of Ejecta from the gossip of innocent noble women. It was quite another to hear it from the lips of one of the Abbey's clergy.
Censors. Why would they come here?
Bettina asked breathlessly.
Ostensibly, to oversee the training of the talented students and ensure that all of our parchment is in order. But their real purpose can only be guessed at.
And what would you guess, brother?
She probed. Henri looked around and cleared his throat nervously.
They're looking for spies, traitors, the children of families who oppose the Council of Counts, loyalists to the late Duke and Duchess, and general troublemakers. It's rather stupid, actually. The Abbey doesn't get involved in politics. The stars are weighty enough matters for our attention.
Though the monk spoke with calm assurance, Avarita could tell by his voice that there was room for some doubt about that. She was starting to suspect that no one would be able to avoid getting involved in politics with what was going on in Falas. People, institutions, and even the temples would be forced to take sides eventually, she guessed.
What happens if they come?
She asked, her voice just above a whisper.
Well, we will contend with it, the old monk said reluctantly. That is all we can do. The abbot will cooperate as much as he can, as long as they do not interfere with the great work. I've heard him say that himself when he spoke of the potential of their visit.
They wouldn't dare disturb the holy temple,
Bettina said, in Avarita's naive voice. In truth, she knew the censorate would dare to interfere with anything they chose. She had heard enough tales about the checkered-cloaked regulators from the family's histories to understand that. The censorate was not answerable to anyone, not even the 5 dukes. Their order predated the 5 duchies and was, by tradition, established by the Norasi king, who had led the conquest. Even after he had died without naming an heir 4 centuries earlier, the censorate he founded
had maintained his royal authority in their business. No duke could override that. That meant that they could go where they wished with impunity, and they could arrest anyone suspected of violating the bans on magic at a whim. They could imprison them, try them in a censorate court, and even execute them, or burn the magic out of their brains with spells that sometimes left their victims mere imbeciles afterward. They would be hard-pressed to, admitted Henri with a grunt. Our temple is not as powerful as the Huanites or the Trigites, nor nearly as large and wealthy. But we are essential to Alshar's dominance of the seas. Interfering with us would harm that work, and therefore the merchant fleets. The Council of Counts would be foolish to do that. If we do not deliver an accurate ephemeris table and other charts to the duchy on time, then navigating through the straits of Sinjar and beyond is nearly impossible. But, he continued with a sad sigh, that doesn't mean they won't try. Don't worry, little Nocturne. The temple will protect all who study here. You need not worry about such serious matters. Ah, the bell. Time for you to head to your lessons, he said, taking the basket from her. Try to put all of this out of your mind. You have more important matters to consider. Of course, Bettina did not stop thinking about the censorate's possible visit.
Okay.
Indeed, the idea haunted her throughout her classes that morning. Her family would be in danger if they came, as would many others. She'd heard other rumors, of course. The girls gossiped incessantly during and between classes, at meals and at chores, and Bettina was very good at overhearing conversations to which she was not party. It was the only way she could get any news, as unreliable as it was. Some of it she could discount as false on the surface, of course. There were wild tales about rebellions and revolts in Reims and among the northern Vale Lords that were clearly fabricated or exaggerated. Count Vicatrol ruled Reims with an iron fist, and most of the Narasi, who farmed the great plains above the escarpment, were largely uninterested in politics that did not affect their own fiefs. Parisian pirates had not invaded the Great Bay either, she was certain, and there were likely no goblins lurking in the shadows up and down the great Mandros River. That was just silly. But other bits of news struck her as more likely. That Duke Rad of Castal had declared himself king, and he had expelled the royal censorate from the lands he controlled. That one she heard from more than one source, and it matched what she'd learned in Falas in the spring. The backwoods spellmonger who advised the Castali Duke had insisted on it, apparently. Even the censor general had given up his cloak to take service with the new king, it was said. Many of those censors who stayed true to their order and their oaths were taking refuge in Alshar with Count Vicatrol, who refused to part ways with 400 years of tradition, especially if it served his purposes. Katina could not imagine a world where she and her family did not have to worry about the censorate. They had been considered a necessary evil for so long that they were part of the culture of Alshar, like Sea Lord corsairs and the criminal gangs that dominated the wharfs of the Great Bay. As descendants of the imperial magocracy, the Coast Lord families had always been a favourite target of the censors. It was part of the Narasi Duke's effort to suppress the powerful nobility of the coasts and the noble houses who produced so many magi who could be used against them. In the early days of the duchy, she knew plenty of coast lords had led revolts against Narasi rule. Usually they ended badly, with the leaders executed or fled to Faris, and the last shred of the magocracy left in the world. But now Faris was in the hands of Castal and Remir, and that remnant of the ancient world was lost forever. Raising a rebellion now against Count Vicatrol and his henchmen would be difficult, if not impossible. That did not stop her from contemplating how it could be done. Such thoughts plagued her until her poetics class, when the lecture from Brother Maurus about the movement of the sacred planets was so engaging that she nearly forgot about her earlier obsession. Afterward, it wasn't until luncheon that her mind returned to the matter, just in time to be distracted yet again by her brother at luncheon. "Greetings, Nocturnes," Dane said in an overly enthusiastic manner as he approached the small knot of girls dining together under a tree on bread, butter, bacon and hard-boiled eggs. Arvarita flinched convincingly as he did so, pretending to be embarrassed by the interruption. "May I borrow Nocturne Arvarita for a few moments? I've had some news from home I wanted to share with my dear cousin."
News?
Katina asked, skeptically, as she pulled herself to her feet.
What sort of news?
Probed Leona suspiciously.
Is she being sent away?
No, nothing like that, assured Atopole in his disguise. "Family news is all. Do you mind?"
Take her,
Leona said dismissively.
She's barely spoken a word all morning. Perhaps you'll give her something worth talking about.
With a backward glance at the Coast Lord girl, Katina dutifully followed Atopole as he casually strolled through the crowded courtyard to a tree at the far end of the garden.
What is this about, then?
She murmured as she followed. "Just as I said, news," her brother replied cheerfully. "News and a spell. For your eyes," he reminded her. "They're starting to look terribly purple. Has anyone noticed?"
Just a bit,
Katina admitted.
I've been waiting for...
"I know," Atopole said quietly, as they were safely out of earshot. "He's been preoccupied, I'm afraid. I saw him 2 days ago, briefly, and he gave me an update. It was all terribly mysterious, of course, but he's been working."
On a heist?
She asked in a voice just above a whisper. Her heart raced with excitement at the possibility. "Shockingly, he did not spare me the details," chuckled her brother. "He said we'll learn in due time. But he did bother to teach me the spell for our eyes. It's actually not complicated, once you understand a few basic rules of photomancy. Here," he said, taking her by the shoulders and directing her to stand next to the tree in front of him. She waited patiently as he closed his own eyes, which were perfectly brown, and then opened them as he whispered a word or phrase she did not understand. There was a slight tingling around her eyelids that she'd come to associate with the spell that disguised her violet eyes. "There," he said with a sigh. "I did it! Not a trace of your true color. I wasn't sure it would work," he confessed.
You weren't?
She asked, surprised. "I've only been studying magic for a year," he reminded her, "and not exactly formally. But Shadow thought this was an easy enough enchantment for me to try. How does it feel?"
Like it normally does,
she decided.
They're a little itchy, but that usually passes quickly.
"That's a thaumaturgic field around..." "Well, no need to get into all that," he said, interrupting himself. "You'll learn about that soon enough, if your Rajira arrives. Any signs of that?" he asked, hopefully. Katina considered.
Well, this morning I was in the far part of the gardens and noticed a big stone arch built into the cliff. Something the ancients left behind. I could sense an awful lot of metal under the soil that covered the inside of it, like the entire thing was made of iron or steel. It was strong.
"That is interesting. Both the arch and your reaction to it. Then perhaps your quickening isn't too far off," he concluded. "How about your...
My monthlies?
she supplied with a small grin as her brother struggled with such a delicate topic.
Nothing yet, but you shall be the first I inform,"
she declared with a wicked look in her tingling eye. Most men were squeamish and embarrassed about that sort of thing, and Katina was enough of a little sister to take a bit of delight in that weakness. "Ugh, no need for that. I was just curious. In any case, I really do have a bit of news from home. Mother is alive and well and working in Falas now. Her task at the Great Bay completed, according to Shadow. She sends her love and says she is proud of us both."
What is she doing back in Falas Town?
Katina asked, curious. "I think she's working with our cousin, Hugh Gwenin, from something Shadow said. But I can't confirm it. Things are apparently heating up at the palace, however."
Rebellion?
She asked hopefully. Atopol made a face. Wouldn't that be nice? No, the counts have been busy. New emergency decrees, new lists of persons wanted for questioning, new edicts prescribing certain violations of law, that sort of thing. There have been a lot of protests. They've arrested hundreds in Falas town now, mostly for questioning over their loyalties. One of the boys in my group says his father is a prisoner now. They're looking at everyone, particularly anyone with a connection to Castal.
We don't have any connections to Castal,
Katina pointed out. Not officially, agreed Atopol. It's just an excuse to intimidate anyone who's thinking about rising up against Vicatrol. There is speculation that he's going to declare himself Duke eventually, but he's not ready for that yet, according to Shadow. But he has extended an invitation to the censorate, he added, his brow furrowed with worry.
I just heard that from Brother Henri,
Katina confirmed with a solemn nod. Rard expelled them. There are an awful lot of censors from Castal that are coming here as a result. Vicatrol pledged to keep the bans up, in defiance of Rard's decree, as a way of establishing his legitimacy. That's bad news. Shadow believes that he's using them to help control the duchy, and keep any secret Coast Lord conspiracies of Magi from becoming active. There was a twinkle of amusement in his eye as he said it.
When will he learn that such things are base rumors or folklore?
Katina nodded sarcastically. That response was what the Shadow Council promoted in public to hide their very real conspiracy against the Council of Counts. Denying the conspiracy, they were actively promoting cast doubts on Vicatrol's legitimacy. The nobility are often willing to believe all manner of unlikely tales, if it helps support them in power, Atopol agreed with a smirk. Still, it is best that we're wary. Katina suddenly frowned.
We may have cause to be, she said worriedly. I got confirmation this morning from Brother Henri that they may well be coming here, to the Abbey, where we're supposed to be hiding in safety. The Abbot is worried since he returned from Falas town, she added.
Everyone with any sense is worried, he sighed. It's a worrying time. But don't let that disturb you. Just cling to your alias. Don't change your story. And hope it doesn't happen in the first place, Atopol counseled. If it makes you feel better, Shadow said he might have some work for you soon.
Really?
Katina asked hopefully.
That would be lovely, especially if it keeps me from doing math. I'm starting to hate numbers, she confided.
It only gets worse as the lessons go on, he reflected thoughtfully. You'll get the hang of it. It will get easier once you actually start applying what you've learned. At least it did for me. I was always confused until I could see what the point of all of it was. Once it becomes useful, it makes more sense, he reasoned.
I'm not certain if it will ever make sense to me,
she replied, shaking her head, discouraged.
My mind has not yet grasped the concept of mixing numbers and letters in mathematical equations. Codes make sense. This type of math does not. Yet. But some real work would be welcome. I'm starting to really get bored, she confessed, letting Avarita's persona slip away for a moment. Me too, Atopol agreed with a grin. I mean, I'm learning some interesting things, and the fellows in my group are all fine, for the most part. But, well, I couldn't stand it any more the other night. I snuck out in my working clothes and took a stroll along the rooftops, just to get some practice in. He looked a bit guilty about that, she noted. Katina's newly renewed brown eyes bulged. Dane, you didn't. You could get caught.
Atopol snorted. Me? Not likely. Not here. People go outside at night all the time. Indeed, the biggest challenge is that there are so darn many people awake at night in Ejecta that there's a risk of bumping into someone. But that kept me on my toes. You should try it sometime, he encouraged. It was refreshing to get into my working blacks once again.
It's going to be a little harder for me,
Katina decided.
The sisters tend to jealously guard the virtue of the nocturnes. Hence the metal grates on the windows. Not that that would stop me, of course, but it does make things complicated. Besides, I value my sleep more now that I have to get up at odd hours for services and such. But a midnight stroll across the rooftops would be lovely. Or just climbing something.
Like that? Atapol asked, looking up at the temple tower looming over the village. I told Shadow that I was surprised you hadn't scaled it yet.
I'm waiting for a special occasion, she assured him. If I do it now, I won't have anything to look forward to later.
I suppose that's one way to look at it. Is there anything else you need? He asked, concerned. Anyone giving you any problems?
Nothing I cannot handle. The other girls are, well, they're being girls. But I can contend with that. Or meek little Avarita can. There's only one who is really irritating. The only thing I really need is an alibi for why we're talking so long. What's our story? They're going to want to know what all the secretive family business was about.
How about a distant cousin who's getting married unexpectedly, he proposed. That certainly counts as sensitive family business. Say a cousin Margine, a dowager who finally landed an aging country knight.
That might work,
She nodded.
Any convincing details?
She has 2 little dogs that won't stop barking, he decided. We met her once at another relative's wedding. She was fat, annoying, and no one ever thought she'd get married because of her little dogs.
I like it,
Katina grinned.
Completely believable too. Everyone gossips about that sort of thing. Just to let you know, there is some speculation about you among my group. Some think you are passing attractive. Your disguise, that is. If they knew how horrifically ugly you really were.
Thank the darkness for my skills with makeup and magic, then, he chuckled. But they think I'm attractive. Really? He asked with more interest than Katina expected. Why would he care what a gaggle of girls thought about him, after all?
I assured them that you were a fatuous bore who couldn't say 3 words without talking about yourself and how smart you are, she assured him.
Best keep the lie close to the truth, Atapol nodded sagely. But that's interesting. Which ones think that? The pretty imperial girl who wanted to send you away? Katina made a face.
Leona. She's horrid, believe me. She's the one I was talking about. Just awful, and not at all nice.
But she's pretty, Atapol pointed out, as if that made up for her glaring character faults.
They're all pretty, except for me,
Katina dismissed.
But she is shopping for a husband, if you're interested. I'm sure she comes with a nice dowry, and she'd make your life miserable if you wed.
Well, as tempting as that might be, you know the family rule. Boys marry the best female thieves they can find, he said with a discouraged sigh.
And girls marry the best wizards they can find,
sighed Katina in return.
In a land where wizards are suppressed and demeaned. I'm sure I'll be a maid as long as our fictitious cousin Margine. Only I'll have cats, not dogs.
Atapol was good enough to escort her back to the others before he departed for his afternoon activities. Then the idiot made a point of lightly flirting with Leona just to irritate Katina, she was certain. Thankfully, he stayed completely in character. He was as boorish as a dandy, and he bragged about his superior intellect 3 times before he finally took his leave. That conversation looked intense, Dina noted casually as she lay back in the soft grass. The next bell would ring soon, summoning them to their afternoon classes.
Were you spying on us?
Avarita asked, surprised.
Not spying, just watching, Mathilde suggested with a smirk. Your cousin is tall, isn't he?
She asked casually.
He's, I suppose,
Katina shrugged.
Compared to me, he is. I never really thought about it, and the news really wasn't much. Just some news about a relative of ours who is unexpectedly getting married in the autumn, apparently.
Oh, Erin asked, her eyes flashing at the hint of scandal.
Is she? She's old, she's fat, and she has the 2 most annoying little dogs you've ever seen,
snorted Katina in Avarita's best voice.
We've only met her once, at someone else's wedding. No one ever thought she'd be wed, but some half-blind old country knight made a proposal. So there you are.
That just proves that Ishi puts someone in the world for everyone, Dina said dreamily. Even if you are old and fat. That should give you some hope, Leona, she said, digging at the Coast Lord girl.
My father is already receiving some offers for my hand, thank you, Leona said acidly. Quite a few, actually. He hasn't even set a dowry yet. In fact, I may be betrothed by next year. There are plenty of handsome young knights interested in an alliance with our house, and a comely maiden, she added, as if it were obvious. I'm sure your dowry has nothing to do with it, and they are all enamored of your engaging personality and reputation for being agreeable, Erin suggested sarcastically. That earned her an irritated glare from the Coast Lord girl. Oh, stop it, sighed Mathilde, who was clearly irritated by the pointless sniping. Leona is a beautiful girl, and rich and well-bred. I'm certain she'll get plenty of offers for her hand, and a beautiful wedding, she added. As I said, Ishi put someone in the world for everyone. Every pot has its lid, my mother says, Dina explained. Actually, my cousin, Dane, was asking about the pretty Coast Lord girl just a moment ago, admitted Katina, feeling wicked for revealing it. It might inflate Leona's already gigantic opinion of herself, but it also presented an unusual opportunity for teasing her. Really? Leona asked, sitting up on her elbows. He thinks I'm pretty. Everyone thinks you're pretty, Nocturne, Dina groaned. At least until you start talking. Then they start looking elsewhere, I imagine. And so what if he does? You cannot possibly be considering my cousin, objected Katina, making Avarita gasp in disbelief. He's not a bold warrior or a landholder, or deaf or stupid. Besides, he's so boring. And likely not nearly rich enough to entertain a serious offer, considered Leona, with a calculating expression on her face. He is not unattractive, of course. It's hard to tell you two are even related, to be honest. But the rural gentry rarely have the kind of wealth necessary to ally themselves with the great houses. He's likely to become a clerk, perhaps, or a counting man, or take holy orders here and spend his life staring at the stars until he's old and blind. Or worse, develop Rajira and how to become a practicing adept or something. I prefer a man of action, she said with exaggerated maturity. You're 13 years old, Dina said, rolling her eyes. You're too young to know what kind of man you prefer. And if you did, you'd likely be wrong and regret the choice. My father would never marry me off without my enthusiastic assent. He wants me to be happy, first and foremost. You, Nerisi, have odd ideas about marriage, sneered Leona. You don't understand how it should be used to build a place of power and security for a great house. We understand that it's a way to become miserable and hate your life if you choose the wrong husband, Dina replied, her eyes narrowing. Marrying for love is just as valid as marrying for treasure, rank and position. More so, if you believe Ishi's priestesses. From there, the discussion devolved into idle speculation about the institution of marriage and the different perspectives the various cultures had on it. Coast Lords, of course, saw it as an opportunity for political alliances. Sea Lords viewed matrimony as a means of gaining economic advantage. The Narasi lauded marriage as a fulfillment of love in song and story, often when it went horribly wrong. Katina mostly kept quiet about it, which suited her Avarita persona just fine. Avarita wasn't particularly attractive, particularly rich, or particularly important by design. Speculating about what kind of husband she might end up with was just depressing. Taking holy orders might have been preferable for the plain-looking, quiet girl to a miserable marriage to a man much older than Avarita just to advance her family's status and wealth. But she did wonder about her own mother's rules on the matter. While they were not concerned in the slightest with rank or position, and certainly not with wealth, they were as stringent as any Coast Lord families. Kiera herself had laid them down centuries earlier as a means of improving the fortunes and skills of the greatest magical thieves in the 5 duchies. Boys married adept female thieves, regardless of class or status. Girls married wizard adepts,
who were subtle enough to keep the family's great store of secrets and add to them. Intellectually, Katina understood the reasoning for the rules. Like the other Coast Lord houses, the goal was to improve the fortunes of the house after their manner. Selecting among the best magi and thieves for husbands and wives made sense from that detached perspective. Otherwise, the great legacy of House Photius would fade eventually, and someday someone might actually get caught, or worse, be better at the trade than they were. But another part of her was deeply suspicious of the custom. It wasn't so bad for her. There were plenty of wizards in the world, after all, and she was sure she could find one, somewhere, that she could stand to marry without plotting to slay him. But for Atopole, the odds were stacked against him. Thieving tended to be a male-dominated trade, from what she understood. There were few female thieves that were more than pickpockets or blatant opportunists. Finding one who was skilled enough to be considered as a bride seemed impossible. But then, her father had met her mother in the middle of a heist, she reasoned. While she hadn't been exactly a professional at the time, she had demonstrated enough skill to warrant his noticing her. Thank the darkness, she had been as passionate and intelligent as even Kiera the Great could ask for. Else neither she nor Atopole would have been born. It gave her a lot to think about, until the bell rang, and she reluctantly headed off to painting class. Chapter 8. A Conversation with Shadow. The rose represents duty and legacy to my house and my art. I have begun to craft my personal deck of cards, and have chosen the Ace of Ships as the first attempt. While I am unhappy with the artwork so far, it does depict a maiden on the deck of a ship bearing a rose, a token of duty well respected in my family. Kiera first came to Al-Shar from Vor, bearing a rose from her beloved, legend says, along with a charge to establish the house here in the west and see it prosper. It is with a significant amount of reflection as to what duty and legacy mean, both to me and my house, that I compose this card. I may well start again from the beginning, as I am unhappy with the result so far, though I've made progress. Duty demands that I complete it. Legacy insists that I finish it as perfectly as possible. But drawing roses is damn hard. From Gatina's Heist Journal. Palomar Abbey. Katina was gratified and excited at the news that her father might have some work for her, and not a little intrigued. She knew that Shadow had business in this part of the duchy, while his children were being educated at the temple school, but she had figured that it likely involved more spy work and information gathering for the conspiracy than actual thieving. But she truly didn't care what the task was. The prospect of getting away from the Abbey and Leona for a few days was enticing to her imagination. She figured that within the week he might make contact with her and give her some details. But the very next morning she unexpectedly spotted the shuffling figure of Dureth making his way across the Abbey grounds, pushing a wheelbarrow. She nearly did a double take and just barely caught herself before indulging in something so suspicious. After all, there were hundreds of servants at the Abbey. Taking undue notice of one in particular would be out of place for dull Avarita. Instead, she lowered her eyes and then very carefully glanced up, catching sight of her disguised father from the corner of her eye. She saw him make a sign with his hand as he scratched his chest through his sweat-stained tunic. He wanted to meet, it indicated. Gatina's heart began to race as she quietly broke away from the group as they trudged along to class and began walking into Ejecta village proper. It wasn't uncommon for nocturnes to have an errand in the village after all, and the temple was not so strict as to insist on absolute obedience to their prescribed schedules. She might be going to the shrine to Trig, for instance, to secure supplies, or to pick up a package from a messenger, or to purchase something from the market or one of the shops.
As long as she didn't look too suspicious, it was unlikely that anyone would even question her business in the small village. She didn't look back over her shoulder, of course, but she could hear the wheel behind her turning loudly in the gravel of the street. Hans, with his laden wheelbarrow, was following behind her, giving her the space to avoid suspicion. He was well into his own character as he began to whistle a tune that he knew his daughter would recognize once she heard it. The River Barge Song, a favorite tune from when she was a child. At this hour of the morning, there weren't many people on the streets of Ejecta to witness her passage. There were 2 village goodwives, she guessed by their clothing, on either side of the high street, both headed away from the village's small residential district, likely going to the market square. Each carried a basket for shopping. It was still 3 days from market day, but there were always a few stalls open to sell essentials during the week. Neither one gave her a second glance as they moved briskly by. They saw nocturnes all the time, she reasoned, and one lone girl in a habit was hardly worthy of note. She passed the sweets shop, which she admitted smelled delightful. She caught the scent of cooling pies, which made her think of old Drella, their cook back home. That made her smile as she continued on her mission. When she came to the village well, which was mostly deserted at this time of day, she stopped and waited for her father to catch up.
Good morning, and a billion blessings upon you, good man,
Bettina said casually as her father set down the wheelbarrow.
Have you broken your fast yet? I had porridge this morning. I've always had a fondness for good porridge.
Her pause between good and porridge was key in the expression, a long-time identification code used by House Batirs and its operatives to determine whether or not someone was included in their secrets. Of course, both of them knew that, but Katina didn't mind showing off under the circumstances. Her father was always testing her. Her disguised father nodded, then gruffly replied with the answer to the code. My grandmother's porridge was hearty and delicious. He paused to allow the certainty of the phrase to register. But thankfully I secured a basket of rolls from the Abbey's bakery. Well done, kitten, he continued in a murmur. Let's step away from watchful eyes and discuss some business while we walk around the village, shall we? He did not look like her father, not at all, but she knew him emotionally. As good as he was at disguise, his mannerisms were a giveaway. You're faring well? He asked as he shoved the wheelbarrow next to the well. I spoke to your cousin the other day. He thought you might be having difficulties.
Only boredom and a little cat fighting in the dormitory, she shrugged. I have an intense desire to climb something which is far outside of Avarita's interests. Nothing a kitten can't handle.
Hans's eyes twinkled, but it wasn't the violet to which she was accustomed. These eyes were pale green, thanks to the same spell Atopol had used upon hers. But they did twinkle. Very well, Nocturne Avarita. But let me know if you have real difficulties.
I'm more concerned about what you've been up to, she said sincerely.
Her father looked around to ensure that no one was watching. Then he cast a silence spell around them, one she had seen Mother use before. Dareth, the occasional carter and frequent liaison of a very special group of talented magi, has been carting things for the Abbey, among other duties, he explained. Indeed, I've had to take a load all the way to the capital this week.
Alas,
she asked with a little gasp.
What's happening there?
Her father frowned. All manner of things, and a few of them are good. The public news is that Vicatrol and the other counts are heroically responding to the emergency by demanding the return of the Duke's heir from Castal.
Angwin, isn't that his name?
Yes, her father nodded. I was there on his name day, and his sister's. But the demand is a ruse. The last thing that Vicatrol wants is a return of the heir. That would ruin his plans. Instead, he is learning who his friends are and who his foes are amongst the nobility and the merchant class. He sees at least 2 of the other counts as potential rivals, and dozens of barons, merchant companies, and great houses, not to mention plenty of temples. So,
He's not about to announce himself as Duke yet? She asked. No, things are far too tenuous for him to make that mistake. He does not yet have the support he would need to take the coronet. Instead, he's compiling lists of his enemies, her father explained quietly. Worse, he's assembling a force to remove them. Spies, informants, assassins. Soon he'll begin rounding up entire families to keep a real rebellion from breaking out.
Kat said one of his cellmates' fathers was already arrested,
Katina provided. He's already gotten control of Falas and secured the support of most of the eastern baronies in County Falas along the Mandrouse River. His associates have secured a great deal of support along the Great Bay, and he has supporters from here to the Narrows in the Great Vale.
He's also allying with the censors,
Katina dutifully reported, her own frown growing.
I heard one of the monks speak of it. He said he heard it from the abbot himself.
We're well aware, her father said, nodding. Suddenly he appeared far more like his alias as Shadow, leader of the conspiracy, than simple Dereth to Katina. Your mother discovered, and do not ask for details, that over 100 of the checkered cloaks have already come down the river, fleeing from the Wilderlands and Gilmora. More on the way by sea, as Ramir banished them and they seek refuge in the west. Even as Rard expelled them, Vicatrol's agents were offering them refuge here for a price. They support his regime and help him control the Magi and the Coast Lord nobility. He will give them safety and a position in his government.
Doesn't that violate their charter or something? Somehow,
Katina asked, confused. Oh, it's entirely an unofficial offer, of course. The censorate cannot legally be subordinate to a duke, much less a count. But the two parties have similar goals and common enemies. They both hate Duke Rard and prefer the law under the bans on magic. So, this is a matter of political expediency as much as it is a shift in policy.
He said they might be coming here,
Katina reported in a murmur. That's unlikely but possible, conceded Hans. Usually, they don't interfere with places like this in favor of more important targets. Already, the censor captain of Alshar and a few of his lieutenants are working on Vicatrol's behalf, under the guise of normal operations and a return to a more rigorous policing of the bans. But it is little more than a mercenary magical corps, subject to Vicatrol personally.
A magical corps?
Katina asked curiously. Military wizards. War magi, her father explained. The Magography used them extensively, but after the conquest, they largely fell out of fashion in favor of Nerisi cavalry. The censorate kept them from ever becoming too powerful. It wasn't until the Phrygian campaign against the Doge of Faris and his mad mage that they were really used in war again, he explained. But the censorate never lost those skills and spells. They've now put them into Vicatrol's service, all without technically violating their own rules. And unlike common war magi, the censors have little concern about the law outside of how it defends them. Some of them are brutal. All of them are vicious fanatics.
That doesn't sound good,
Katina said, shaking her head.
Not for the conspiracy, at least.
It's not, agreed Hans grimly. Vicatrol's mundane spies we can contend with. Magical thugs with no real constraints on how or who they use their spells on. That is problematic, he admitted, his expression troubled.
So, what are we doing about it?
She asked, her voice just above a whisper. What we have to, and you'll learn only what you must about that, he reminded her. But hope is not lost. Every mishap hides opportunity. The involvement of the censorate may actually work in our favor in the long term. In the meantime, we shall continue to do what we have been doing. Learning information, making plans, and taking action when we need to in order to protect our people. That is really all you need to know until you are called upon to help.
That can't come soon enough,
Katina said sourly, earning a chuckle from her father. My curious kitten, is the Abbey not holding your interest? He teased, amused and concerned, but also likely knowing the answer. He opened a wicker hamper in the wheelbarrow, revealing a half-dozen fist-sized rolls.
Prayers are boring, chores are tedious, history grows stale, math is beastly, and this alias feels like a wet cloak with buck teeth, she said, bearing the prosthetic she wore to demonstrate. Running the streets of Falas was exciting. Sometimes I feel like I'm going to scream if I don't steal something, she revealed.
At least the food is decent, he said, opening a tiny crock, which proved to be filled with butter. I will credit you this. You have outlasted both myself and your brother in staying on the grounds before taking a clandestine walkabout of the village. Hans reached for the basket of warm rolls, breaking one, buttering it, and offering half to Katina. How are the lessons? Katina took the roll and bit into it just as her father asked her question. She made a face. It smelled better than it tasted. Too much salt in the dough, she theorized. Frella would have thrown them out, but the butter helped. Sorry, he said. I know the food here is not that tasty. At least it didn't used to be very palatable. I think it's gotten a little better than I remember it, but I want you to tell me truthfully, kitten. How are you really faring at Palomar? Katina took that moment to swallow her bite, take a sip of water from the well's communal dipper, and gather her composure. Her father was inviting a truthful report, complete with complaints and criticism. That was rare, and she felt obligated to take advantage of the opportunity.
Yes, the food is passable. I have certainly had both better and worse meals. I find the garden work to be enjoyable. I'm growing to dread my turn at the laundry. The Abbey grounds are pretty. Painting flowers is boring, though I have worked on a few of my cards. I don't think they're very good yet. The monks and nuns are nice. The Sagonites pray a lot, though, and have a lot of odd ideas. Poetics is interesting, and I have discovered that I am very poor at my numbers, at least compared to the other nocturnes. She paused and reflected. She hoped she did not sound ungrateful or like Leona. But while the Coast Lord girl was on her mind... And there is one girl who is so mean. Katina had not planned to say anything to anyone, ever, about Leona and that situation. But her emotions got the best of her. She is just awful, Father. She complains, she insults, she abuses everyone around her. I don't know what to do or say to diffuse the situations and the conflict she seems determined to cause without acting out of character. Adversity is part of life, kitten, he said sagely. How you respond to it builds your character. I believe there is a house rule about it. Katina nodded. Yes, I know there is. It's one thing to read about it, but it's another thing to live it. She seems very focused on Northern Alshar's politics, but almost in a misguided manner, as if she bears some grudge against the Wilderlands, or just Narasi in general. She doesn't think very highly of Sea Lords either, nor lower status Coast Lords.
I know the type, her father agreed with a wry chuckle. No doubt her parents thoroughly spoiled her, treating her like a little duchess. I'm guessing she's also unhappy with the monastic life.
Deeply,
Katina agreed.
She hates it. But there is no real reason for her to be. She's just mean. She's always trying to start a fight over something, or make someone feel awful about themselves. Anything to dominate everyone around her. Oh, I know that I could easily put her in her place, but that would destroy my alias and draw attention to me, she sighed, staring at the well. It's very frustrating. I just don't know what to do about her.
Study her, her father suggested unexpectedly.
Study her?
Katina blurted out in surprise.
I can barely stand her. I'd rather push her head into this well or lock her inside her box bed.
Study her, Hans repeated firmly. She sounds awful, petty, vindictive. So study everything about her, every attack, every word she speaks, every ugly expression on her face. Someday, you will need an alias that acts like her, he reminded Katina. You will have to cultivate an alias who is just as mean as she is at some point. It's best that you understand how to do that, and the best teacher is someone who is that mean. It will make your alias sound more authentic. Just like with the censors getting involved, every mishap hides opportunity. Darkness has provided you with an ideal model for you to study. Use it, he urged.
I can do more, I suppose, Bettina decided with another sigh. I still don't really understand why you sent us here, of all places.
She really didn't, and she was still more than a little upset by it.
Atty seems like he is actually enjoying it, she added accusingly.
This isn't the most entertaining life, but it is safe. It has always been safe, and never particularly entertaining, Hans confessed. I was miserable at first, but then my Rajira arrived. This village is where my training began.
Bettina looked at her father again in surprise.
Oh yes, this is where I began my studies, both in class and out. Indeed, where better to learn how to practice magic and operate under the cover of the blessed darkness than at an abbey of stargazers who sleep in the day and work in the night. This entire village was my classroom in that. There are places here, hidden places, where such work is done. Secret classrooms, workshops, yes, even a studio for swordplay, libraries of spell books and grimoires, hidden rooms and staircases to long-forgotten cellars. That sort of thing. You will begin to learn to be a mage here, and you will continue to learn to be a thief. But first you must learn to be a nun, he concluded. He reached for the battered tin dipper and scooped water from the well, then sipped while Bettina absorbed what he had just said.
It still feels like punishment for what I did in Falas, she said reluctantly.
Hans chuckled. Well, kitten, your mother was rather upset. But had you not undertaken those missions, I doubt that we would have been able to successfully form the conspiracy as quickly as we did. Now, I know that your mother explained that you only know what you need to know in order to complete a mission. That is a rule. It keeps everyone safe. But in certain instances, having a larger picture of the plan is necessary. And that is why I'm so glad I lingered in Ejecta, because now I need your help with a mission.
What kind of mission?
She asked, suddenly eager. Remember all of that loot from our spree a few weeks ago? He asked, cocking his head. She nodded. There was no way she could ever forget that. The entire family had sat around that pile and toasted the heists with good Bikovar wine once they'd gotten home. It had felt like a great accomplishment, even though the profits were all going to fund the conspiracy against Vikatrol. It was one of the most exciting things she'd ever done. Well, while the gold and silver are easy enough for us to use, he related, there were several objects in that hoard that are far more valuable if they aren't melted down, and some that can't be. So, we need to turn to a fence.
Bettina nodded. She knew he was speaking of someone who specialized in quietly buying and selling stolen goods. He'd explained that in the past. Mother had also discussed the topic briefly back in Falas town, but she had not gotten around to practical lessons on the matter. Don't we have one in the family? She asked suddenly.
Several, agreed Hans. But fences specialize just as thieves do, and sometimes location matters. If we try to sell this stuff anywhere near Falas, it could be recognized. Some of it is so rare and expensive that only certain kinds of buyers are available for it. So, we have to seek out a very special fence to get rid of it. Someone who can pay us and then sell the loot without attracting the attention of the former owners, or Vikatrol's agents.
You know someone? She asked eagerly.
Hello.
And why do you need my help?
I do. A man who lives on an estate not too far away. I've dealt with him twice before, years ago, under another name, of course. And despite your mother's inclinations, I think you should go with me. Not Cat. I argued that it would be instructive, he conceded, and I could use the extra set of eyes and ears. Our friend in Falas is increasing the pressure on his men, among others, to locate certain items recently stolen from the country estates of his biggest supporters. The sooner we get rid of that loot, the better, especially if he's getting the censorate involved. They have ways to track such things, location spells. Katina was startled at the idea.
They can track stolen loot?
She asked, alarmed. They're wizards, he shrugged. It's not a hard spell, Hans admitted. Oh, they won't be able to track the coin, but some of those things we took are quite distinctive, enough to use a spell to find them. You can counter it with certain defenses, but the problem is that there are plenty of different kinds of location spells, and we can't counter all of them indefinitely. If that loot is tracked, it will lead back to the Shadow Council. So, we need to get rid of it.
And you want my help?
She said, as much to get his commitment to the mission as to clear up any confusion. It should only take a few days to travel and meet him and see what he offers us. I will make the arrangements with the Abbey to excuse you. You may accompany me under the following conditions. First, you must remain in character at all times. You must be a traveling nocturne on a sacred mission from the Abbey, and no one must suspect otherwise. Hans looked intently at Katina, his eyes conveying the seriousness of the request. That was easy enough to do, she decided. She nodded in agreement. Second, you must return to the Abbey immediately after this excursion. There will be no side trips or casual wanderings into strange ruins, rat-infested sewers, or intriguing-looking taverns. Nor may you talk to strangers or try to make friends. That's another good reason to travel as clergy. Third, you are observing only. There will be no action on your part. You are not to say or do or especially steal anything that I don't approve of. And when you do have something to report, you tell me outside afterwards, when we are alone and unobserved, what you saw, think, and feel.
I can do that,
she assured him with confidence. This might seem like a casual trip, but in truth, there is more danger here than I'm comfortable with, thanks to the political situation. Remember, there is still very much you don't understand. Any action on your part may very well lead to jeopardizing either the mission or our aliases. Do you understand? And agree?
I can agree to those terms. When do we start?
Katina asked eagerly, with a buck-toothed grin. Chapter 9. Black Silk Thread. Opportunity is a fickle mistress, a slave to fortune's capricious whim. Sometimes it's a trap set to ensnare us. Other times, fortune chances to reveal it to your naked eyes and dares you to seize it. To know one from the other is the height of mastery of our great art. From the Shield of Darkness, written by Kiera the Great. Katina waited patiently for 2 days for her father's summons, dutifully carrying on with her routine at the Abbey. As Avarita, she had no trouble stumbling through the daily courses, chores, and devotions with the other girls. As Katina, she was getting increasingly anxious and excited at the prospect of a new mission with her father. Finally, on the morning of the 3rd day after their meeting at the well, Night Sister Namandi announced the Nocturnes' new assignments over breakfast. While most of the girls in the group were rotated into new chores, as expected, the nun gave special assignments to a few of them.
Nocturne Erin, you are to report to Adastra Hall and begin special instruction in mathematics with Night Brother Cortamar. Nocturne Leona, You are to report to the Nocturne Hall for special assignment. To Dusk Sister Ardenia. Nocturne Avarita. You are to report to Nocturne Hall for special assignment for a technical pilgrimage. Please pack a traveling bag. You may be gone for a few days. A technical pilgrimage? Asked Mathilde, confused. What is that? Occasionally, one of the senior clergy will need to take special observations from a vantage point outside of the abbey proper, the nun explained patiently. It's traditional for them to be accompanied by a nocturne or two to assist and observe the procedure for instructional and devotional purposes. They can last anywhere from a day to a week, depending upon the specifics of the observations. Now, whose turn is it to clear away the table? Katina had already packed up her travel bag, of course, including a number of items that most nocturne initiates would never have taken, concealed in a secret compartment at the bottom of the heavy leather satchel. After bidding farewell to the rest of her group, she trudged the heavy bag across the abbey's grounds to the Hall of Nocturnes, where she waited until she was called into Dusk Sister Diandine's office. A tall, black-robed monk was waiting next to her table. Initiate, this is Night Brother Espus, the old matron introduced with a gesture of her hand. He is one of our travellers, Night Brothers who wander the duchy to undertake specialized observations for the temple. Wander implies a lack of direction, sister, Espus scolded, in her father's voice. It was slightly deeper in timbre than usual, and he was using an accent she placed as more prominent in the upper Great Vale than the coastlands or the Great Bay. But there was no doubt in her mind. She nearly startled when she realized who the tall monk was. His hair, his face, his eyes, even his height had been altered, she saw. He wore a shock of dark hair and a full but neatly trimmed beard now, and his shoulders seemed to be wider. He must have been wearing boots with lifts in them too, she figured. His eyes were now a pale blue, but there was no mistaking that voice, no matter how he tried to disguise it. A billion blessings upon you, brother, Avarita said hesitantly, giving the monk a bow. Billions and billions, Brother Espus said automatically. Can you figure? He suddenly demanded. How are you with numbers? I am adequate, brother, Katina admitted in Avarita's timid voice. We shall see, he said sharply. And your hand? How is your henmanship? Passably readable, brother, she assured him, looking down at her feet. I see. Are you able to identify the necklace, the anchor, and the crab constellations? Katina knew that she could do that. I can do that, Avarita answered, this time with a stronger voice and a glance at Brother Espus's face. And I know the triangle is ever in the north, she added. Again, we shall see. I don't normally take a nocturne as an assistant on these errands, but this trip will take me all the way to Inmar in the north, and a little assistance would be welcome. Ever been there? No, brother, Avarita answered, meekly shaking her head. I've only been to Palomar since I left home. You're a scrawny thing, her father said, as he examined her with a stranger's eye. I expect you don't eat much. Pray to darkness you don't speak much, either. I value my sleep and don't have time for foolish questions. Have you ever driven a team? No, brother, Avarita. That produced a grunt from the monk. I suppose you can learn, then, he decided. Will she do? Sister Diandine asked impatiently. If not, I'll have to summon another. That will take time. Time I do not have. The stars wait for no man, he reminded her sternly. She will do. Or she won't. We shall discover that. Come along, girl. What was your name again? He prompted. Nocturne Avarita, brother.
Katina answered. Well, Avarita, get your baggage out to the steps, he said impatiently. We'll climb the path up to the temple, where we'll secure a carriage. A few days north to Inmar, a night or two making observations and measurements, if the skies cooperate, and then 2 days back.
As you wish, brother,
She agreed, hefting her satchel and departing, with a nod toward the nun. She's as new as a lamb, she heard the monk complain to Sister Diandine as she left the office.
All nocturne initiates are,
Diandine dismissed.
Try keeping to the temple for more than a few days, and you might remember that.
Avarita didn't speak until they crossed the abbey's grounds to the head of the long, winding path that switchbacked up the face of the cliff between the two merry waterfalls. When she was certain they were far beyond earshot, and she was struggling to heft her bags as she climbed the steep path, she finally grunted.
I thought you had forgotten me,
she said accusingly. I had to make some preparations, her father explained. I had to resurrect this old alias, for one thing. Plain old Dureth wasn't adequate for this mission. But we'll be riding hard for 2 days, mind you, before we even arrive in Inmar.
We're really going to Inmar? Wouldn't a barge upriver be faster?
She asked, skeptically. Yes, and far more noticeable, he agreed. We're trying to obfuscate our movements, remember? The last thing we want to do is attract any undue attention. The Abbey's special carriages should avoid that. Indeed, there was a carriage and a team of horses already awaiting them when they finally made the top of the escarpment. A sworn nocturne stable boy held the team steady while they got their baggage aboard. Then blessed them as Hans drove the team away and down the road leading north. Once they were on the road, they relaxed their aliases and became father and daughter once again.
So, why are we going to Inmar?
She asked, intrigued. She'd heard of the famous city of temples, of course, but had little idea what it looked like or how far away it was. The fence, I know, has an estate there. Inmar is a wealthy place, as well as being beautiful. It's famous for its hunting. He doesn't care for the sport himself, but he gets plenty of wealthy customers who summer up there who do, and he can make sales far from the oversight of anyone in Falas. Quietly, of course.
Does he have a shop or something?
Katina asked, curiously. Oh no, at his level, he is far beyond keeping a mere shop. He has a noble estate just outside of town and simply throws parties all season. He's known among the upper gentry for the amazing bargains he happens across, and they never ask questions. As a fence, he pays out decently, not the best, not the worst. But he's one of the few fences who has the possibility of reselling some of this loot without arousing suspicion.
Can you trust him?
Katina asked, after considering the matter.
Does he know who you really are?
She clarified. He doesn't, though I'm certain he suspects. And no, I can't trust him. You can never truly trust any fence to whom you aren't related. They are in an unenviable position. They must have a permanent residence in order to do business. But that puts them in a delicate situation. It means that they're subject to leverage by the authorities, because it's hard for them to move around with all of that stolen inventory. You always have to be careful when dealing with a fence outside of the family. But I trust his greed and his ignorance. I doubt he would even have heard about our recent heists, he assured her. They spent all morning chatting, with Hans instructing Katina in all manner of lore about the family and its unique profession. Katina enjoyed herself immensely, despite how hot and sweaty her nun's habit made her. It was rare that she had an opportunity to discourse with her father alone, in private, for any length of time, and she took full advantage of the opportunity. They made good time, too. It had barely rained in the Great Vale this week, so the road was dry and dusty. While they occasionally passed a peasant on his way to market, or a carter delivering goods by wagon, the road was quite deserted of fellow travelers. If avoiding notice was important to Hans, he'd chosen the perfect route to do so. The weather was perfect, a warm summer's day with only big, friendly clouds in the sky. The gently rolling landscape presented the Great Vale to Katina in all of its understated fertile beauty, with small groves of trees or fences of rocks and stones separating expansive fields of wheat, barley, maize, and oats, each crop eagerly stretching from the soil toward the sky. Pastures of sheep and cattle grazed contentedly in their pastures at regular intervals. The breeze was gentle, just enough to take the edge off of the worst of the summer's heat. Birds chased each other through the sky, while bees and other insects whirred by on their important errands. By noon, they had passed through 3 villages and had come to a 4th. Katina guessed they were spaced out this way to facilitate the local markets, but it seemed as if each of them had been grown from the same seed. They were so similar in appearance and composition. Still, she found them interesting. They were built far more simply than the farmhouses in the south that she was familiar with, she noted. Instead of brick or stone, they seemed to be half-timbered structures of wattle and daub, their roofs uniformly thatched with the straw that grew so abundantly there. Neither were the streets paved in any of them, the way a coastlands village of any size would boast. "The Great Vale is Narasi country," explained her father as they approached the 4th village. "It has always been one great plain with a few woods here and there. It was deserted and unsettled even during the Magocracy. There was still plenty of uncultivated land in the coastlands back then, and our ancestors made more coin growing grapes and fruit and olives and such to make the trip up the escarpment into the Great Vale. But the Narasi lords preferred grain farming to horticulture. Their grain god, who in the tiller, compelled them to look for better drying lands for that than could be found on the coast, where the weather is too wet and unpredictable for much grain. Within 3 generations of the conquest, most of the good lands north of the falls of Falas had been claimed by some tawny-haired knight or another. It's better horse and cattle country, too," he added as they passed by a corral with a couple of the big beasts within. "You know how the Narasi love their horses."
So, why are the coast lords so at odds with the Narasi?
She asked, though she suspected the answer. "The very same reason the sea lords are usually at odds with the coast lords. They resented the invaders the way that all conquered peoples do," he reflected. "The Magi and the coast lords had ruled over Alshar as counts of the Magocracy for 3 centuries before the Narasi came along. They had the havens under control, a booming trade in wine, olives, and hemp, and were making plenty of money under the imperial rule. When the Narasi came with the first Duke of Alshar, they resisted. But the Magi had lost much of their power by then, and the censors were powerful war Magi. Mostly Wenshari turncoats, who would rather work for the Narasi barbarians than bow to the imperial authority of Remir."
So, what happened with all of those wizards then?
She asked, curious. Hans shrugged. "Some capitulated and accepted the bans on magic and continued life as best they could. Those who couldn't bring themselves to do that fled to Faris, which resisted Narasi rule for another 4 centuries. Others hid themselves and strove to strike back at the invaders. That's what House Fortius did. There was a century where the Narasi dukes were facing a magical insurgency for a while. Our ancestors were part of that," he added proudly.
They stole from the Narasi?
She asked, interested in that side of history. "Oh, we stole them blind," Hans chuckled. "It's all in the detailed history books. Kiera the Great's twin grandsons, Tangarot and Langarot, were raiding the strongholds of Narasi horse lords from the Great Bay to the Great Narrows for decades. Famous couple of thieves, those. Hengarot fell to his death at 80 when he scaled one of the temple towers in Inmar, he reported with pride. Langarot died peacefully at his estates in Reims a year later. Between the two of them, it's estimated they stole over 100,000 ounces of gold, according to their heist journals.
That's a lot of gold,
admitted Katina, whose studies in mathematics had given her a new appreciation of just how big a number that was. Enough to buy estates, ships, and influence at the ducal court, her father agreed. If Kiera laid the foundation of our house in Alshar, Hengarot and Langarot built the first few floors. Let's stop for luncheon, he proposed as they came to the hedgework at the edge of the village. There's a tavern here that has good lamb stew this time of year, if I recall correctly. And I need to water the team, he added.
Will I have time to look around?
Katina asked, curious. A little, her father conceded. I don't want to tarry too long, but the horses need a little rest before we press on. There are a few shops herein. I think the place is called Esterpool. But don't steal anything, he cautioned. As prosperous as the village is, it is far below our standards. Esterpool was not much larger than the village she was familiar with back home in the Falas countryside. It wasn't on a river, she knew, so it sprawled evenly out from the central market, which boasted a chapel to Huon on one side of the square and a small temple to Trig on the other. A line of tiny shops had sprung up in between. While Hans tended the team, Katina stretched her legs and began wandering from shop to shop. The people of Esterpool were a little taller and had lighter hair and complexions than the peasants she was used to back home, but otherwise they behaved the same. The Vale folk were largely Narasi stock, she realized, not the darker imperial blood of the south. She was uncomfortable at first with the amount of deference the local folk seemed to pay her. She was unused to people bowing to her respectfully and seeking her blessing. It was a little exciting, she decided, to enjoy that kind of position and authority, even if the ignorant farmers and shopkeepers didn't realize that she was still just a novitiate. They couldn't tell the difference between a nocturne initiate and a night father, she figured. They just saw the habit and acted respectfully. One of the shopkeepers even gave her a free biscuit after she delivered a mumbled blessing. Though Esterpool was a sleepy little village, it was a little larger than the first three they'd passed through, and it was a crossroad as well. 20 miles or so west was the mighty Mandros River, while to the east were mile after mile of abundant farmlands that sent their surplus wheat and barley through the village on its way to larger markets. There was a lot of artisan traffic too, she noted, and the occasional merchant wagon or pack trader making their way east to west or north to south. There was no sign of the strife and conflict inflicting Falas and the coastlands that she could see. That is, until she spotted 3 men in very distinctive black and white checkered cloaks, and her blood froze in her veins. Royal censors. There. The 3 men were also wearing leather armor under their cloaks, she noted as her heart pounded in her chest. They wore snugly fitting iron helmets over cloth coifs. They carried themselves as warriors as they dismounted their horses, and she could see the distinctive swords they wore over their shoulders. Mage blades, she recalled. The chosen weapon of war magi, heavier by far than her slender shadow blade, and often enchanted with spells to give them advantage in battle. They were businesslike in their demeanor, and they were clearly intent on something. One held the horses, while 2 others entered one of the shops. Katina couldn't help herself. She followed them. She hadn't intended to. The smart thing to do would be to slink away into shadow, make herself unobtrusive, and remain unseen. But she could not stop herself. After so many recent conversations about the censorate, to stumble upon 3 of them there, in the middle of nowhere, seemed just too convenient not to take advantage of opportunity, she realized. Katina was smart about it, of course. She waited a decent interval before deciding to enter the shop, walking in Avarita's inelegant gait. She passed right past the man holding the horses and gave him a glance and a shy, buck-toothed smile before she headed into the shop behind them. It wasn't much of a shop. In Falas, she would have passed right by it without noticing it. 2 stories, tall and narrow, with the merchants likely living on the floor above. There was only one window to let the light in, so there was a bit of gloom. The place sold notions and sundries, mostly thread and yarn and some needles and pins. There were bolts of cloth rolled up in the centre of the floor toward the front, and a thick pair of shears on a rope nearby. Baskets of thread and yarn, empty spools and knitting needles of bone or horn lined the walls. More cloth was suspended from the rafters to keep it out of the way. A middle-aged man with a scraggly beard and a well-stained apron lingered in the back, where he seemed frozen at the unusual sight of the 2 big censers. His eyes were wide with surprise. Apparently, he did not get many men as customers, much less royal censors. The 2 were talking animatedly among themselves, and just loud enough for her to hear, about Falas. And that caught her attention immediately. It also invited further investigation, however foolhardy that was. She made herself as tiny as a kitten and as quiet as a mouse as she eased closer to them while earnestly trying to avoid looking as if she was doing so. She willed her body to become invisible, as she had seen her father do so many times, or at least unnoticeable. She gently eased down to her knees and pretended to study the baskets of thread stored on the bottom of a shelf. From this vantage point, she could study the men's feet and hear their conversation as the sound bounced off the wooden floor. Both men wore sturdy boots meant for riding or kicking indoors, not working fields. She had seen many of these types of shoes in Falas on the feet of guardsmen and soldiers during the riots. She could hear them speak more clearly from there, too, she found.
300 miles through the gravel wastes for this,
one of the men was complaining.
We get to ride dusty roads while the captains ride south in comfort on a river barge, like proper gentlemen. And for what? I didn't figure I would be chasing down unregistered hedge witches and harassing village spellmongers when I came to Alshar. I could do that in Castal.
You do as you're ordered, the other man shrugged as he studied a shelf of spools. You know how we left Castal. What did you think we'd be doing?
Organising to overthrow that upstart duke, snorted the first man. You can't just start calling yourself king and throwing the order out like that. There need to be consequences.
You can if you have a whopping big army and a commander who's a traitor, the second man said as he pushed the spools around. Calm yourself, Corporal. We'll see to Rard in time. Until then, we do as ordered. Captain Nargis wants every foot wizard in Alshar crapping themselves when they think of us. Every adept too afraid of the order to even think about stirring up a rebellion. Captain Stefan is intent on his investigations. That's how the Count wants it. And right now, we do what the Count wants. You, he said strongly as he pointed toward the clerk. Do you have any strong black thread? Really strong, he emphasized. Not this linen. It's as thin as a whisker. Cotton? Strong cotton? Silk, my lord? Asked the merchant as he dug around in a basket. I've got some strong black silk here. Do I look like I can afford silk? The censor asked, irritated. It's not on starving, my lord. It's from the Shattered Isles. Half the price, he assured. Strong enough to fish with, and black as night.
You'd look good in silk, the first man jibed.
Shut up, the first man said casually. Strong enough to keep this cloak together for another week. Oh, aye, my lord, the merchant agreed enthusiastically. We use it for stays and boning, for the ladies, and girdles for gentlemen, of course. Nothing better, nothing better. Oh, fine. Give me 6 yards of it, the censor snorted, fingering his torn cloak. A foot wizard tried to get away and yanked on this one so hard, the seam's split. I won't be able to get a new one made till we get to Falas. Pissed me off so much. We hung the scoundrel, he said with a hollow laugh. The merchant swallowed hard at the casual mention of an execution.
Half price, my lord,
he assured, enthusiastically nodding his head like a bobbing chicken as he nervously wound the requested length around a small wooden spool.
That's near to my cost. Always looking to help out the authorities.
That's good thinking. Now that the counts rule Alshar, the second man advised. Vicar Troll keeps the bans rigorously. He's dedicated to the law, and we are always about. If you hear tell of any stray witches, you let us know at our station in Cumray, or any other strangeness.
Oh, there isn't so much as a dowser in 20 miles of Esterpool, my lord,
the merchant insisted as he presented the spool to the censor with some ceremony. How about talk against Count Vicatrol? Asked the second man, raising an eyebrow.
Who, my lord? I don't know any nobles beyond Baron Ridden, I'm afraid. No counts or such. Of course, the Duke and Duchess, bless their poor souls, but no counts.
Why? He asked, confused. Never mind, dismissed the censor, eyeing the man critically. It's above your station. You don't look the type to start a rebellion, I suppose.
Would you like a needle with that, my lord? A thimble?
He asked, his voice shaking a bit. I've got my own sewing kit, just no black thread, the censor dismissed with a growl. How much?
2 pennies, my lord,
the man said apologetically. It took a moment for the censor to dig his purse out of his belt and find the coins.
You said you hung a foot wizard, my lords,
the merchant asked hesitantly. 2 days ago, up in Inmar, agreed the second man. Found a pair of them. Put a lot of practical adepts to the question too. We found much was out of order. Seems like your folk have gone slack when it comes to the bans, he observed. We'll soon set that to rights. Captain Nargus has charge of this entire county now, and there's more of us coming. And Captain Stefan is always on the hunt for mischief. Katina waited until the men completed their transaction and left before she presented a half-spool of red linen and a pretty copper thimble to the merchant, along with 2 silver pennies. The man looked entirely disturbed.
Who are they?
She asked, hesitantly, as Avarita would have.
Soldiers. Wizards. And soldiers. Enforcers. Censors, they're called, sister, he said, shaking his head. Never seen them up close before. They make sure the Magi stick to the straight and narrow way. Not men to cross. Not at all. They can kill you with a glance, so it's said. And no one will do anything about it. If you're a wizard, she said, glancing over her shoulder toward the door. Well, hard to tell if you are or aren't, if you're hanging from a tree by a noose, isn't it?
He pointed out with a snort.
I suppose it is,
Katina agreed. Indeed, she hadn't really thought about the kind of power the censors had.
A billion blessings upon you,
she added, as she took her purchases and left. The censors were already gone when she went outside. She was rather relieved at that. She hurried back to the tavern, where her father was already sitting on a bench outside with a bowl of stew. Katina sat down beside him and tried to calm herself. It was late for luncheon, and there wasn't anyone within earshot.
Brother, I just saw...
she began. I know, Hans said quietly. I saw them leave. What were they seeking, I wonder?
Thread, actually,
Katina reported.
Black thread. They were just stopping by on their way somewhere else.
And you had a chance to listen to where, I take it? He asked.
Cumray. They report to a Captain Nargus. They're from Castal.
You picked up quite a bit in a short time, he praised.
Including how they just hung a foot wizard in Inmar for ripping his cloak, she said, shaking her head slightly at the thought of such a brutal punishment. They don't usually resort to that sort of heavy-handed treatment, Hans reflected, his voice far too casual for such a harsh subject. Father, I heard what I heard,
Katina insisted, exasperated, but struggling to remain calm. She closed her eyes and practiced her breathing technique, which helped to slow her breathing and heart rate, an essential skill for a thief or a spy.
The censors are coming for unregulated magi, she insisted. That's what they said. And they work with the counts now. They mentioned Vicatrol by name. And I don't think they will stop until they've found all of them. They want to control them. Us. Or at least Vicatrol does.
Katina was absolutely certain the three censors were fanatics. That's what they do, Nocturne, her father said calmly. The entire point of the censorate from its inception was to suppress the Magi in the name of regulation. And don't forget that they are Magi themselves, each trained not only in war magic, but in special arcane interrogation techniques. Their spells can wring the truth out of a man like water from a dish rag. They promote the most subtle and vicious into their leadership, and they have absolutely no compunctions about their power. Say, hanging a man out of hand for ripping a cloak.
Just like the Brotherhood,
nodded Katina. The Brotherhood of the Rat, the criminal gang who controlled the docks and river ports on Count Vicatrol's behalf, were filled with thugs who would stab you in the back for a few copper pennies. No, they're actually far, far more dangerous, Hans countered, his voice just above a whisper. You haven't gotten your talent yet. When you do, you'll understand a bit better. Magic gives them a great advantage over the Brotherhood, and while the rats are motivated by greed and opportunism, the censors are more disciplined and more idealistic. That makes them fanatics. That's what they do. He sighed, the slightest bit of frown appearing within his false beard.
They just came from Inmar, she pointed out uneasily. Are you sure it's safe to go there now?
If they just came from there, then yes, it probably is safe, he decided. It's rare that there are two censors in a single county. 3 altogether is significant. If they've already been there, then we'll likely see no more when we arrive. Darkness willing, he said, with a small smile. Chapter 10. A Fence in Inmar. When cultivating a convincing alias, it is best for the thief to work from truths and half-truths, rather than fabricate a story. The temptation to employ a lie may seem easy at first, but oft those mistruths bring trouble and complications. Exploiting the trust of others is simple enough, but to do so without arousing suspicion demands that the thief keep the threads of his alias woven tightly together with the strength of truth to support the fiction. From the Shield of Darkness, Commentaries. Inmar was a beautiful city, stunningly beautiful compared to Falas, Katina decided, as the carriage rumbled across the neatly cobbled streets. Known as the City of Temples, her father explained it was the religious capital of the duchy. Every major sect had a temple there, and they all boasted beautiful green tiles on their roofs. Katina had gasped when she first saw the place in the soft morning sunshine, earning a grin from Hans. The shimmering blue lake in the background seemed to conspire with the delicate marble architecture and the vibrant green rooftops to please the eye. I had the same reaction the first time I came here, he chuckled. It's unlike any other city in Aushar. It's a playground for the upper nobility, wealthy merchants and senior clergy, he informed her. Inmar has a bustling commercial quarter, a prosperous artisan class, and a reasonably solid servile class. Plenty of students, artists, and minstrels too. There are temples, schools, libraries, theatres, hostels, and a number of incredibly fine inns. It's a great place for a thief to holiday in, or spend loot, or in our case, to dispose of some. Katina tried to look everywhere at once as they rode through the streets, much broader than the streets in Falas. Indeed, while the capital city was filled with unexpected turns,
and an almost haphazard layout due to its long and tumultuous history, Inmar seemed completely orderly, with stately stone buildings surrounding the magnificent central square and beautiful statues, fountains, and plazas that seemed to all have been created by the same hand. Falas was chaotic, she decided, but Inmar was sublime. Hans, still in his guise as brother Espus, secured a room at a fancy inn called the Duke's Dalliance. It was as different from the inns she'd seen in Falas as the streets were. Indeed, it seemed to be decorated more like a temple or a palace than a simple hostel. While the innkeeper who took their fee raised an eyebrow at the sight of a monk and a novitiate paying for an expensive private room, Brother Espus made a fuss about noise. The thickness of the walls and his ability to sleep during the daytime to an extent that seemed to justify the high price, which he also complained about. While Katina carried the baggage up the narrow but intricately carved wooden stairs to the gallery that led to their room, Brother Espus disappeared for nearly an hour, leaving poor nocturne Avarita to sit in the common room in her habit, shyly mumbling blessings at the departing travellers. Avarita was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, of course, but Katina was drinking in every detail as she waited. Within a few minutes, she established in her mind the composition of the staff, the quality of the clientele, and a goodly bit of neighbourhood gossip. Twice, a serving girl only a little older than she shyly brought her a small glass of weak ale, then asked a few awkward questions about the Saganite order and Avarita's duties. After that, Katina was so quiet that most everyone else left her alone. Katina found she enjoyed the perceived authority that the grey habit gave her. It really was a superior disguise, as it brought with it all sorts of notions about her, such that she was intensely spiritual, that she had a touch of power about her, and that she was honest by nature. Avarita, of course, did share some of those traits in Katina's imagination. But Katina was far more concerned about the people coming in and out of the inn and their errands than the mystical nature of the stars or her apparent sanctity. There were many merchants at the Duke's Dalliance, some local and some travelling from long distances to sell their wares to the elite of Inmar. Katina guessed one was a jeweller, by the fine leather satchel he kept close to him and the hulking bodyguard who followed him everywhere. Another was a cloth merchant from the south, whose cart filled with fine silks and cottons and had just arrived in Inmar. There was another clergyman staying at the inn too, a high priest of Lewin the lawgiver in a rich black silk robe who seemed to be dead drunk when he arrived. He barely glanced at her as he stumbled up the stairs to his own room. There were always a number of very beautiful girls in stylish gowns who frequented the inn, as if it were a festival day. Katina gathered that the Duke's Dalliance was a favoured gathering place for the local nobility, as well as travellers, from the casual way the women were greeted by the staff. By the time Brother Espus returned, Katina had discovered quite a bit from the casual gossip. While a few of the people in the spacious chamber glanced at her respectfully in passing, after that they ignored her, as if she were another statue. That was another function of a nun's habit, she realized. It provided a kind of invisibility all its own. People saw the robe, but not the girl inside it. It was fascinating, listening to other people's discussions. She was almost annoyed at having to stop once her father came back. But by then, much of the morning traffic had waned, and there were only a few servants left. "I have sent the message," he said as he sat down beside her. "He is in town, as I expected, and likely to meet with us tonight. But we will have to change clothes," he added, tugging at his own black habit, "and I'll need to shave. He knows me by another name. Hungry? Let's get a few cakes to break our fast before we nap." He raised his hand and summoned the serving girl. "Which one?" Katina asked, curiously, after the girl left to fetch some cakes and more ale. "He knows me as Dronadol, and he knows that's not my real name," Hans explained. "He knows I work out of Falas, sometimes in the cities along the Great Bay, but I stay out of the Great Vale, which makes him more eager to buy." It can be awkward to try to sell someone's stolen goods back to them. That's professionally embarrassing.
What about me?
Katina asked, curious. I've had companions both times I've used him, so he won't find that unusual. One was your mother, he said, smiling at the memory. That was an exciting time. But you shall be my new servant girl. He won't ask questions in any case. He deals with all manner of people in his business, and he knows enough not to ask too many questions. He doesn't